Hello, this is Kyle under Christian Idealism, and today I have a special guest on. His name is Daniel, and today we're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin because that is something that has come up recently. The first thing I want to sort of address is that we are not going to be skeptical of the Shroud, so we're not going to debunk anything, but we're also not going to try to authenticate the Shroud as some others have done. What we're going to do in this stream is basically try our best to talk about the most recent study and then contextualize it within the larger literature. And that's why I brought on Daniel, because obviously I don't study the Shroud as much as he does, but he knows the literature better than anyone else I personally know. So I brought him on. So yeah, anyways, that's the goal today. So just discuss that. Anything you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to start off sort of reiterating what you kind of already said in the opening. It's just a bit of a disclaimer. One, we're not here to debunk anyone. So really our analysis of some of the new studies by Giulio Fanti and his team at Padua, it's meant to just sort of to contextualize more than debunk. If you want a really, really good critical look at the paper, I'd recommend watching David Falk's recent live stream on it. He's coming from a background where he's a little bit more aware of some of the scientific methodology used in dating artifacts than I can. So he brings out a lot of good details there. But really, more so, what we're going to try and do is help folks that are coming, maybe they've read one paper or seen a documentary on the Shroud, how to sort of contextualize different data points and stuff like that. Because when you actually do a deep dive in the literature, you're going to find a lot of different viewpoints. And trying to make sense of it is very difficult. And a lot of folks end up either just unintentionally misrepresenting it just because of how diverse the field is with different disciplines and different perspectives, or they end up, being wholly dismissive of everything. And then, you end up with a lot of cynicism around it, which I don't think is very healthy. Couple other disclaimers is like neither Kyle or I are experts in the subject matter. I'm just a layman. My degree's in music composition. I just got interested in the Shroud as a teenager and just kept reading and reading and reading. So hopefully I'll be able to give a perspective for folks that are coming from maybe different, maybe non-scientific backgrounds on how to sort of adjudicate some of these papers and sort of understand that a little bit. The other thing I wanted to sort of mention is that just because I've seen this happen a lot in discussions on the Shroud, in both pro-Shroud and skeptical sort of discussions, a lot of talk about sort of philosophical and theological presuppositions. Both Kyle and I were sort of high church Christians. Kyle's a Roman Catholic. I'm a confessional Lutheran. We're both very comfortable with the idea that the Shroud could be the burial cloth of Jesus, but we're also not committed to that for theological reasons. Perfectly open on that end. So we're very much just trying to look at the data and parse out and see where it goes to the best of our abilities. So hopefully that does a good enough job of sort of just contextualizing where we're at and where we're coming at these studies too, for the audience.
Yeah, I just want to add because there has been this stereotype, I would say, that most of the Christians that do accept the Shroud as authentic have been Catholics. And I just want to say, as a Roman Catholic, I don't obviously, I've already stated my opinion. I am totally agnostic on whether the Shroud is actually the cloth of Jesus. And we should not be so quick to either affirm that it is nor deny that it is, because I think there's some interesting studies. And we can, especially with the carbon-14 dating, we'll certainly get into that and how that we'll also contextualize that as well. But with that in mind, Daniel, so this recent study that came out, obviously there's been a lot of news articles on it, a lot of people talking about it. I know Cameron had someone on recently to discuss it, at least, and he's trying to also get one of the authors to interview. So like, what does the study actually say? And then how does it fit within the larger, like, how do we contextualize that study within the larger literature?
So I think there's sort of two aspects to this question. The first one is, what does the news reports sort of say about the article? And then what does the actual article actually say? Because there's sort of this trope in Shroud literature. Every couple of years, a paper will suddenly be drug up by some tabloid, generally around Easter time. It's a little odd that it came this early. And either it's going to prove the Shroud or it's going to debunk the Shroud 100%. And that runs. And then there's all this energy around the topic for about a month. Maybe if you're lucky, you get a couple years worth of energy around it, and then it all dies off. One of the major sort of things that I just want to say preemptively is that if you're really serious about trying to study this, don't read don't read any of the media outlets, because they are very they do not have the resources to sort of contextualize this at all. They're very much looking at conclusion points and sort of just basing it off that. You never know if the author of the articles themselves have any scientific background. But even if they do, there's oftentimes this sort of misunderstanding between the primary literature and sort of these popular level secondary literature authors. A very famous example of this would be the 2012 NEA study on the Shroud, done by Paolo Di Lazzaro in Italy, where they were able to color some linen fibers using an XMR vacuum ultraviolet laser. And they were actually just testing a model that was proposed by John Jackson, one of the founders of the original 1982 STIRP investigation. And their conclusions are actually pretty modest. They're like, okay, this sort of model by Jackson can't be disproven that way. And then the media reports go, it's a miracle. The Shroud's created by lasers. And it's like, you can actually find interviews with the author where he's just like very frustrated visibly by this. And so that's always my one caution for folks when they sort of start with media articles is try and find the papers themselves. Try to actually do the primary work too, because that's going to be contextualized a lot more. The other thing about this article specifically, it's done by a team consisting of Giulio Fonti and others from, I believe, Padua University is where he teaches at.
Yeah.
This is not the first study that Giulio Fonti's done specifically with this method and also alternative dating methods in general. So what he was trying to do is use an X-ray technique that's used in that's used to date crystals a lot of times, and some apply it to linens. So he's trying to invent a new dating method and applying it to some shroud material. This isn't the first time he's done it. I believe it was back in like 2015 or so that he did a series about 4 different tests using Raman spectroscopy and then also some mechanical tests on some shroud fibers, attempting to get a date range that sort of corresponded a little bit better with the 1st century than the C14 dating. So this is kind of another sort of wrinkle in on this. Again, I would highly recommend anyone that's really interested in a really in-depth analysis of this paper to go watch David Falk's stream on it. It's a very good, very in-depth critical examination of it. But I think there's a couple points that we need to sort of point out. One, it's an alternative attempt at dating. And that's sort of kind of an odd thing for most artifacts and stuff like that. Most of the time, we have pretty standard ways of dating them. There's a couple hiccups that come with the shroud. One, it's not an it's not sort of uncovered from the earth, right? This is an artifact of unknown provenance. We don't know where it was originally manufactured. We don't know where it was originally found. Our earliest indicator seems to come from Lille, France. And even there, we're still not 100% sure how much of the original account is accurate. It's famously reported in the De Arcis Memorandum. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing the French right there. But basically, one of the bishops claimed that he interrogated the artist who manufactured the shroud, and he confessed to painting it. Well, we know it's not a painting. We'll talk a little bit about why we know it's not a painting, or at least a standard painting. Recently. So that's sort of a big question, is like, how much of that original account can we really sort of trust? So we have all these big questions about where does the shroud come from and what's its origin and manufacture and all that sort of stuff. So all the sort of normal ways we could sort of contextualize artifacts, like with their pottery or the layers it's found in, other things that we can sort of use to sort of shore up our testing methods and stuff like that, just aren't available to us. So we're kind of left with an artifact that's just sort of floating around. It's very hard to sort of test that way. And naturally, there's going to be suspicion around it. And it kind of reminds me a little bit, if you remember the James ossuary from a couple decades ago, because it was sort of discovered I believe it was discovered in a guy's basement or something like that. So it
Yeah.
was like the provenance was very hard to establish and stuff like that. So there's always going to be this open question. The other thing is that a lot of these alternative dating methods are kind of seen as a way to either circumvent or sort of contextualize the 1988 C14 dating, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So that's sort of the main idea with the paper, is that it's an attempt to sort of develop alternative dating methods to sort of test the shroud a little bit. It's not the first method being used by the author. He's sort of developed a couple. And just a couple things that we need to sort of point out first is, like, one, they're all ad hoc, meaning they're invented for the shroud. We're not seeing it really tested on other analogous sort of objects. So that's going to be a little, some people get their suspicions raised up. I don't think that we have to be 100% as cynical as this. I'm actually pretty on board with someone trying to find different ways to date the shroud with using non-invasive measures. I think that's awesome. Just because of the nature of the 88 test, which we'll talk a little bit more of, there was a lot of missed opportunities to contextualize samples. So any attempt to sort of get more data on shroud material, I think, is great. The issue, though, is how much stock are we going to put in a brand new method that's been tested on one object?
Yeah, because I want to, to sort of add to what you're saying. I mean, technically, every single dating method we had has been quote unquote invented.
Yeah.
Right. But so, like, that's not the issue. The issue is that there's no precedent for this. And so if someone wants to present, like, oh, this dating, that we did shows the Shroud of Turin is from the 1st century, it's like, whoa, hold on there. First of all, there's a lot of, like, the main issue is just that, like, this dating method was invented for the shroud. It hasn't been done on any other artifact before. So maybe we should, not, like, we need to test actually, okay, is the dating method itself actually reliable, right?
Yeah.
And what I would say is, there's no reason to dismiss it, right? But there's also no reason to think that it's reliable either. So it's somewhere in the middle. Right?
At least offhand, at least prima facie, we try and employ the principle of charity here. I think, sometimes you see this as a rhetorical sort of barb from folks that are really passionate about being skeptical towards the shroud, where they'll sort of dismiss anything new as pseudoscience and ad hoc. And it's just like, for me, when I look at it, I'm like, maybe folks can't produce the data to back stuff up. We'll talk a little bit about peer review too, a little bit later in the stream too, and why certain data points just don't make it through peer review in regards to the shroud. But I think there's a more charitable way to sort of interpret this. I think this is, I think folks can generally have a genuine attempt to try and find new ways to investigate the shroud. It's important to remember the 78 investigation. A number of the techniques that were used to study the shroud were invented ad hoc, because nobody had really tried to study a cloth this way before. So if you look at the 78 team, they spent about 2 years just inventing and then sort of practicing. So they would literally go in, have big meetings, and they would practice step by step each of their sort of experiments. And because of that, over the 2 years after their investigation, when they were collating their data and publishing, a lot of their findings has sort of withstood the majority of the criticisms. That doesn't mean that they're all perfect. Sometimes, a lot of times, just as technologies develop, we sort of have found new outliers that weren't able to be sort of accounted for in the original studies. And then we sort of pull back and adjudicate, like, our confidence in those conclusions accordingly. That's one of the big things that I think all folks that are interested in the shroud should apply to this new study immediately. It's like, it's a brand new dating method. Even if everything went right and they did their experiments perfect and there's no concerns whatsoever, it's one test. One of the awesome things about the shroud is there's a whole dialectic of different scientists coming from different perspectives, and there's a reproducibility in a lot of the data and stuff like that for some of the experiments, which you don't get in a lot of studies on relics, whether they be Catholic, Orthodox, whatever. You just don't get that in a lot of different areas around this. So I think that's really cool about shroud literature. But it is something just sort of to caution. And this is something I always employ as a layperson. When I see, like, a new finding and stuff like that, I sort of go, okay, that's cool. But let me wait. I know a couple of the skeptics are going to hit back. I know a couple of the other sort of pro Shroud folks that are coming from different perspectives are going to hit back. Let's wait 5 years or however long it takes for this dialectic to sort of develop and see where it matures. Where are people in agreement and where are people in disagreement? And, that's one of the big advantages of actually having literature like this for an artifact, as controversial as it is. You don't get this with other sort of Catholic relics. You don't get this with Eucharistic miracles. You don't get this with other images. So
Nope.
there's another Italian sort of image of Jesus that's allegedly the face cloth. It's kind of funny. I remember hearing the late Barry Schwartz once go, like, I'm not touching that one. Don't ask me to investigate one. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, just because, the Shroud's been an enigma. And regardless if you're pro or anti-Shroud, it's going to develop a conversation. And there's sort of this old adage that, for every question you solve on the Shroud, 5 new ones pop up. So that's mainly what I want folks that are positive about this study is just pump the brakes a little bit. Even at best, this is a preliminary study. It's one study. And
one. It doesn't prove anything.
Falk's Falk's video will go through too, but like the sample size is small. It's minuscule. You're talking about 9 cloths. And one of the major issues that he brought out that I didn't pick up the first time I was reading the paper is that there's no blind sampling. Now, in fairness to the authors, it's very hard to blind sample the Shroud anyways, because it's just a very unique cloth. That's actually an original criticism of the 88 testing. So it doesn't mean necessarily that their results are incorrect or something like that. It's just that there's not a good check on it. Because generally how a lot of these dating methods, when you're inventing them, you wanted to be as blind as possible. Because what you want to do is get your date first independently without it being contextualized, and then see if it matches to another dating method, such as your C14 dating. So that's just some of the more specific issues with this particular study. But it's even at best case scenario, even if I'm actually kind of curious to see if Cameron's able to get some of the authors on, because I think that's great actually hearing from the authors themselves. That's something you don't get a lot on popular presentations.
Nope.
Most of the time it's literature summaries of the literature. And in that case, it's, well, how best can a guy summarize a really diverse and pluralized dialectic in 30 to 60 minutes?
Yeah, and I was gonna add because I don't think people realize just how much literature there is on the Shroud. Like, there's literally 100 different fields.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the tropes in response literature, is that you'll sort of see this is guys will punt to the textile experts. It's like, oh, your experiments didn't you didn't get any textile experts to sort of write off on your experiments. Because like that's a big issue, and there's differences in linen. I mean, this was one thing. If you read through some of the literature on some of the experiments, how difficult it is to find like unbleached linen and stuff like that. And there's little things that pop up. One really great example comes from some of the blood studies that have been done in recent decades. Because one of the big questions that's still around the Shroud is like, why is the blood stain still red? Regardless if you think it's a medieval product or a first century artifact. There's this big question about the blood, because coming out of the 1980s, 1990s, the consensus has been more so that it's the best explanation that the blood stains are composed of hemoglobin or actual blood. But that's still a big mystery. Blood, regardless of whether it's a medieval artifact or a first century artifact, should not be red. So there was a number of attempts to sort of hypothesize like why the blood was still red. And most of them, unfortunately, a lot of the early ones, they were more so proposals than they were actual experimental reports. But one really interesting one was proposed by the late Ray Rogers. And he was going off, I believe, someone else's research here, because someone had used a piece of linen that had been soaked in saponaria, which is a sort of ancient sort of, not a dye, but it's sort of used to sort of in the manufacturing process of the linen. And Rogers hypothesized that this is actually pretty big important factor for like the image formation. And so he was using the blood study to sort of back up his image theory. So he sort of proposed that the saponaria, when combined with the blood, prolonged the redness. And he reported that, this third party had done an experiment where 25 years later, the blood has still been red on this cloth that had been soaked in saponaria. Now, it wasn't up until recently that we had any sort of experimental data on it, because Rogers never published. A lot of this comes after Rogers' death, unfortunately. So he never published any raw data. He never published any pictures. So it wasn't really until Kelly Kirst a couple of years ago decided to try and replicate his study that he found that actually there was no shifting of redness with saponaria added to a cloth. But what Kirst did, being that he's a blood chemist, he has his background's in immunology approaches to blood, whereas Rogers a chemist. He's not a blood specialist. He sort of hypothesized, Kirst did, that the blood that was used was probably stored using glycerin just to preserve the blood. And what that would do would maintain the color. So that's kind of some of the examples that just pop up in Shroud literature, since it is such a diverse field. You could be a really great chemist and be one of the primary guys that worked on the 78 Stirp team and know the cloth better than most people do in the world, and still make little mistakes like that just because it's not your background. And stuff like that pops up all the time in Shroud literature. And that's why it's so important to sort of contextualize any paper on the Shroud within the background of the larger dialectic.
Right. And so I wanted to ask, is there, I guess, two questions. The first question is, when we're talking about experts, right?
Boy. Yeah.
I see a lot of people, like, for example, I will mention some names. So, for example, like Father, I think Andrew Dalton, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
People call him expert, but he hasn't published in literature. I mean, it's not really fair to call him an expert.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be cautious a little bit, because it's not to sort of say that we need your degree to be in syndenology.
Yeah.
There is no field, right? It's a very open process, and you kind of need it for a field this diverse to sort of get the perspectives that you need. With respect to Dalton, I know he does work with like one of the Turin associations, so he's hanging around some really good people that are major voices in sort of the dialectic. However, when we talk about experts, what I mean by expert is somebody with a terminal degree in a relevant field that is actively publishing in peer-reviewed literature. So that's going to rule me out right off the bat. So, treat us with the same amount of skepticism I'm trying to encourage here. And, this was one of the great things about my buddy Dale Glover, who runs the channel Real Seekers. He was actually getting, folks from different perspectives who actually have written on the subject on the discussion. And it's really interesting to see how, the dialectic is shaped. That's not to preclude folks that don't have terminal degrees. There have been folks without specific specializations that have had major influence on the field. I mean, Joe Marino and Sue Benford are really famous for just annoying the crap out of Ray Rogers until they got him to test the reweave hypothesis for why they think that the Shroud might be, the dating might be skewed. Stuff like that happens. But again, there's a process, scientific peer review, right? It's not just one sort of study that's done ad hocly. You need a whole body of literature, and you need folks that are able to sort of comb through that dialectic in a way that's appropriate. Now, unfortunately, there are folks in the dialectic that I would say that have become part of the Shroud lore with terminal degrees in relevant areas that have produced very, very problematic papers. Let's say that much. I won't name names, but there are certain folks, and it's funny, some folks, as soon as they get called out from it, will retract their statements and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's just stuff that emerges out of the dialectic. And one of the things I want to encourage anyone, especially folks that are on the skeptical side, one of the things that really jumped out to me was I began reading some of these summarized papers, folks by stuff done by John Jackson, who was one of the founders of the Stirp investigation, and Giulio Fanti, in regards to their evidences and how they sort of weighed their hypotheses against each other. And one thing I found really quickly was that these are two very pro Shroud guys, and they both adopt very ad hoc imaging formation models. So they're not opposed to weird stuff, but they were coming to different conclusions on how they weighed their data. And that got my brain to jump off and go, okay, there's not this clean cut consensus like you might see in certain popular level presentations.
That was going to be my next question, which is, what's the consensus?
Much to the chagrin of one Dan McClone, there is no consensus. To be 100% frank, it's very hard, just in general, to do anything close to a head count amongst syndenologists. One, who are you going to count? Are you going to count only the physicists, the chemists, the historians? Are theologians allowed to comment on? Because I think that's still pretty important, depending on like their branch of theology. If they're an analytic theologian, they're going to have huge things to say on like just whether or not God's intervention in a situation is even appropriate to sort of postulate. So like there's this huge question of who do you count? Second off, like there's only been, as far as I can tell, 2 real attempts to sort of try and come up with a big list of consensus points. One was in, I believe, the 2005 Shroud Conference in Dallas, where they got a whole group of syndenologists from varying perspectives to try and rate the quality of certain data points that you see pop up in the literature. And what's kind of interesting is like you get a general range and stuff like that. But I know in particular certain researchers that were part of that don't agree that all the facts there are as poorly evidenced or as well evidenced as what the final result says. So it's almost like a little bit for folks that are familiar with like the Jesus seminar, sort of the voting with beads stuff. That sort of attempt to try and draw up consensus is naturally going to lead to some misconceptions on where everyone exactly is. So that's one of the challenges. And lastly, it's just like when it comes to sort of trying to draw up a consensus, is that the data points move over the centuries. So this is just something that we have to sort of be careful of. It's like the dialectic where the shroud was in the 1970s and 80s. It's way different than where it is starting in the 2000s, and really different from where it is right now. The sorts of conversations we're having are just different. And one last point is that there's always going to be naturally this sort of, this urge to sort of say, well, even if we could get all these folks together at a conference, how many of them are just going to naturally be biased? Because who's going to go to a Shroud conference except if you believe that it's real? Well, that's not exactly true. I mean, Hugh Ferry, who's probably my favorite skeptic of the Shroud, he was the former editor of the British Journal for the Shroud of Turin. So there are folks that are skeptical that are still involved in this field. But beyond that, even if you go into the pro-Shroud side, there's huge debates. I mean, you have folks that are more in the line of sort of Ray Rogers, that this has to be explained via a natural sort of process of the body dying as gases are released. It's creating a chemical reaction on the shroud. And that's the only way to sort of explain it. We got to stick to a strict scientific method. And there's people that are very adamant on that. And then you have guys that are maybe a little bit more out there, sort of saying like, no. The only reason you're doing that is because you're beholden to naturalism. I have this crazy radiation model, and I can account for all the data easy. And then you have, so there's huge discrepancies. And what I really love is when I find scholars such as Paolo de Lazzaro, you've heard me mention his name a couple of times, where he's able to sort of go, okay, if you can model me something crazy, it doesn't matter how crazy the theory is, as long as you can model it to where you can make predictions, I can test those predictions. And if I get positive results, awesome. But I'm not going to go around saying I've proven the shroud. I'm going to go, yeah, we can't rule it out this method. And it's sort of that approach of this sort of almost Karl Popper-esque falsification to some of these theories that I think actually improves conversation here. So, I mean, to be frank, going back to your original question, is there a consensus on very few points? There's certain data sets that are generally well agreed upon. And then there's a lot of interpretive disagreements. So one very famous, we can sort of go through 4 of the big imaging features that get brought up a lot in discussions of how is the shroud made. One is sort of the light-dark reversal, or the photonegativity. Even using that term photonegativity, some people are going to get upset at me because that's really not, a lot of people use the description of it to sort of as an analogy. because this feature was only discovered when, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the photographer's name, took a picture of it, and he found as he was producing the negative that the shroud's face sort of popped out more because the lights and darks on the shroud are actually reversed. Now, you see this a lot in popular presentations where they go, it was the first photograph of Jesus. And it's like, well, no, there's artistic methods to get light dark reversal. That's not very hard to sort of explain. But right there, that's a data point that's generally largely agreed upon. But you're going to have huge interpretive differences right away. Is that really a light dark reversal due to some sort of imaging process? Or is that just an imprint process? That's a big discussion. Perhaps more famously is the quasi 3D effect that you get from the shading of the shroud. And this is a big area of discussion. And actually, it's been there's a decent debate that's still, I think, going on in the literature as to how do you account for that? Because maybe 10, 15 years ago, it would have been stated that this has to be produced by a physical object because the shading of the image sort of corresponds really well with topographical information that could be encoded if a shroud was laid over a body or a statue. But within the last 5-10 years ago, there have been some voices that have been proposing that there are alternate ways to sort of achieve that effect without it being through a body. So again, these are little things where we're taking a pretty well attested data point that there is this sort of shading effect that is very easy to, or I shouldn't say very easy, but it is coherent with topographical information from a body. But whether or not we should interpret that as evidence that the cloth laid over a body, or if there might be alternative explanations, is something that's still, that's something that you have to actually dig into the literature a little bit more. You have to get to the primary resources and stuff like that, because that's not stuff that's going to jump up in a 30-minute presentation on the shroud. Regardless of how good the presenter is, they just don't have the time to sort of go through all these data points. So that's sort of how some of these consensus points can be a little bit more murky than maybe presumptively like how we sort of approach them and stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So what would you say, did you want to talk about the carbon-14 dating and...
Oh boy.
Yeah, that's, or did you want to wait till...
We can go into the C14 dating because I think this is an important part, especially with the recent paper, because this is sort of seen as the boogeyman, I guess, for like the Rose Shroud side. And here's one of the things. I'm going to try my best to steelman the actual objection from carbon-14 to the Shroud's authenticity, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding sometimes in the popular audience that it's just one test, and that if it wasn't for that one faulty test, we'd have an authentic Shroud. Just like I think that people can misunderstand like the arguments of the pro Shroud side, especially with the image features, how powerful that actually is as data points. I think people can misunderstand the power of the C14 dating, and that's irregardless of one's views of like C14 and stuff like that. I'm just going to say this right now. I am not a YEC guy. I'm perfectly fine with C14 dating. It's a very well-known dating method. Unlike this current dating method that we've been sort of discussing, right? There's a huge body of literature on it, independent of the Shroud. So any criticism that I'm going to have specifically of the C14 dating is not going to be in particular to C14 dating. It's going to be about this particular Shroud. And really more sort of my goal is going to be sort of summarizing the dialectic surrounding the C14 dating. That way folks have a better understanding of where the discussion actually is amongst the Shroud literature folks. So that hopefully, like, if there's one thing I hope that comes out of the stream, is a little bit of empathy for both sides. I think there's really good reasons to think that the Shroud is authentic. I think there's really good reasons to doubt the Shroud's authenticity. And I think, I don't think people are crazy or religious zealots or just rampant naturalist atheists when they approach the subject matter. I really do. If you want my honest sort of thesis, it's just like the Shroud data is an underdetermined field data set. It's an underdetermined data set. And until more investigations are actually made on it, we're not going to be able to close the gap as much as we want to. So with all that sort of, disclaimers put out, one of the things that has to be discussed a little bit is just what is the C14 results. Well, in 1988, they took a sample from the Shroud of Turin and they divided it into 3 slices and sent it out to 3 labs, and they tested them. And they all came about roughly to a medieval date, roughly to where we see evidence in the historical record. And it's that important point that needs to be sort of talked about. It is not simply that we have a medieval date for the C14. It's that this medieval date fits so well with our historical record that it's sort of these 2 points coming together. In a normal artifact, this would be enough to sort of, get people stop talking about it a lot of times. If we did not have the other scientific dating, I don't think most people would be really that interested in the Shroud. So it's really important that it's not just our C14 date, it's also our C14 dating plus the historical attestation to it. And that is sort of what is sort of pushing this, what we might call this sort of skeptical view of the Shroud, or this artistic view of the Shroud. And it's really important to note that, just because a lot of folks just think it's just a C14 dating, and as long as there's something wrong with the C14 dating, we can discard it. So that is sort of like the overview of what the argument actually is. A little bit about the history of the C14 dating is that originally it was actually proposed to do C14 dating as part of a second STERP investigation. Following 1982, as STERP began publishing their papers, there was a lot of energy surrounding the Shroud and a lot of excitement about potentially doing a second investigation. And one of the things they wanted to do was carbon date it. It was the logical next step. We've sort of categorized the image. Now we need to do something a little bit more with the dating. So as the years went on, they started making proposals, and I think it was something like they wanted to take 6 samples, roughly somewhere around there. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, this is where some of the politics comes in, and I want to be as charitable as possible to both the STERP investigators and then also the scientists that actually studied the C14 dating. It's like there's some politics here that came in here, and I'm trying to be as respectful and sort of summarizing this dialectic as best we could. Basically, what ended up happening is that the STERP proposals that were going to have multiple sites for testing, and they were also going to do multiple physical and chemical testings of the samples. So we had a complete description of what was actually being tested, was eventually discarded in favor of doing a more less invasive test of taking just one sample from a corner. And there's a lot of discussion about whether that's the right spot to be testing and stuff like that. I don't think that's necessarily the most pertinent point, but that's one of the first things, because a lot of times when you see popular skeptical sort of representations of the dating, they'll sort of say, well, multiple tests were done. And that's not really accurate. It was one sample that was divided in 3 and tested 3 times. And that's a major difference between taking multiple samples from different parts of the Shroud. Because one of the major objections that is sort of come into the literature from folks that were concerned about this, you even see folks voicing concern prior to the C14 dating, even from some of the skeptical sides. Even sort of folks that were more skeptical of the Shroud were like, hey, I don't really like just testing one time, because if we get one sample and test just right, how do we know that's representative of the cloth as a whole? So that's some of the preliminary stuff. Over the decades, what's sort of been proposed is different alternative methods to try and account for a dating to be skewed as much as it is. And generally, most of those have not gone very far, just because of the laboratory sort of reports and the cleaning preparation that's actually employed for C14. A lot of the common contamination theories just don't hold up to scrutiny. The big issue is not simply, is a C14 dating accurate? Because it can be inaccurate. The question is, how could this C14 dating be so inaccurate that it produces a medieval date instead of a first century date?
Right. So sort of, I guess, ask about that. So what you're saying is, like, of course, we're going to hear from pro Shrouders is that, oh, well, it was just contaminated. That's the reason why. But it's not that simple, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of, it's not simply, can I give an account for why a C14 dating might be skewed? And this is what you actually see in a lot of this is actually kind of what you see in a lot of the preliminary responses. I know William Meacham, he was an archaeologist that was sort of consulting, or I don't know if he was a consultant to STERP or if he was just hanging around. I forgetting their exact relationship, but he was very vocal about this. It's like, hey, there's anomalies in dating the Shroud, there are anomalies in carbon-14 dating. The issue is that most of those anomalies have generally been well documented. Like, you sort
Right.
of get the typical objections like, well, you can test a snail and it's going to tell you it's going to be in the future or something like that. Situations like that are pretty well known and stuff like that. So it's not simply about showing that the C14 data um,
Is flawed in that
is
area, because I
flawed.
mean, it could be flawed in the sense that, like, the shroud could come from, I don't know, the 1000s, right?
Yeah,
That would make more sense. But the problem is that the pro shrouders want to say, oh no, it's from the first century. So
exactly.
you're talking about a 1500 error
Yeah,
in the
well,
in the test.
1200 to 1400
Yeah,
years. That's a big
yeah, that's
era.
huge.
And
Yeah,
you need to sort of this is sort of the second part of the argument. It's like, it's not simply that we have an aberrant date, it's that it locks up with our historical record really well. So it's you have to find a non ad hoc way to sort of account for it being skewed that much, and it just perfectly lining up for the most part with the Arsis memorandum. And that's very hard to do. And there's been, as far as I can tell in the literature, there might be more, but like the four main discussed ones, one has to do with like biological film. That's largely been discarded since like the 90s, because it became really apparent that the amount of additional biological material required was going to more than double the mass of the shroud itself.
yeah.
And at that point, we have to sort of discount all measurements ever made on the shroud. I don't think anyone pro or
No.
anti-shroud wants to do that. The second attempt was actually a little bit more interesting, and I actually thought it was a pretty ingenious idea. This was done by John Jackson again, who was one of the founders of STIRP, and he sort of suggested, well, we know that the shroud's been in a couple of fires. Perhaps some of the carbon monoxide produced by those fires could have artificially aged the shroud, or de-aged the shroud, excuse me. And that actually caught the attention of, I believe I'm forgetting the scientist's name. I want to say Ramsey, but I might be mistaking him, from the British lab that actually tested the shroud originally. So they, back in 2008, they actually did a whole documentary with the BBC surrounding this in their initial sort of experiments surrounding this. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, they never really found any positive results, and it was kind of abandoned. I think there was maybe one article produced on it, but it wasn't very thorough, to my knowledge. It's been a while since I've looked at that paper, so I want to be a little cautious in sort of summing it up. But basically, Jackson's proposal never really got that far on. So most folks don't really use it to account for the data. Perhaps the most famous account for the dating being off is what's called the reweave hypothesis. This was proposed by, again, some layfolk, Sue Benford and Joe Marino. And quite famously, they were dubbed by Ray Rogers part of the loony bins of the Shroud folks. And he got so frustrated with this, he decided, you know what, I still have a sample of what's called the Reyes sample, which is a sample that was taken prior to the 78 investigation, adjacent to where the C14 dating was taken. So he decided to open that up and sort of look through a microscope and see what he could find to sort of disprove them. It's just like, I'm going to just look at it, and it's going to show that that the sample is homogeneous with the shroud body as a whole, and that's going to be the end of it. Well, when he opened it up, he saw cotton fibers. And he's like, wait a minute, the shroud's made of pure linen. It's not supposed to have cotton fibers. And that sort of began in roughly right around his death, unfortunately, a sort of new renaissance in shroud research in the early 2000s, because there's all this excitement. It seemed like we finally had a really good explanation for how the dating could be so off. Now, as with anything, there's a little bit more complexity to this, because what's interesting is that while Rogers was really sort of persuaded by his findings, other pro-shroud researchers like John Jackson and others just weren't, because of some of the other some of the other physical tests that they had performed in 1978 with all their examinations. Jackson feels like they don't have enough data to really support a reweave hypothesis that there is alien material in there. He really feels like, no, you can't explain it that way. So there's sort of this dialectic that's going back and forth. And Rogers published most of his material right before his death. And then there was some critical pushback on that. And there are questions surrounding how plausible is it to go from the cotton fibers to sort of saying that this is a heterogeneous sample. Because one thing that is known is, like, even if you're using all linen, sometimes if you use cotton on a loom, cotton will find its way into the manufacturing process. Beyond that, there's always the worry about contamination, because The shroud has been handled by thousands of people over thousands of years, and they weren't all wearing pure linen. So the chances for contamination are there, especially when you're dealing with a sample that isn't being investigated as part of the whole cloth. So that's part of the big issue, is how much of Ray Rogers' findings can be sort of extrapolated across the whole shroud as a whole using just one sample. And this is an active part of the dialectic. This is something that sort of gets brought up a lot. I think it's really interesting. I remember there was actually a theology, like an MA theology student. I read his, he did a big in-depth review, and he was following mostly Rogers' study. And it was actually really great as a layman, seeing another person coming from a non-scientific background sort of assessing the data. But he sort of did this big, long thing addressing all of Rogers' sort of dating methods. And he sort of goes, like, these are all really interesting. They have some positive impacts, but the dialectic isn't ready to accept them whole cloth just because his findings are incomplete. We need a larger body of data to sort of support or rule these hypotheses out. And that's something that you're going to find a lot in the Shroud literature. We have ideas. There's really cool stuff that pops up every once in a while that actually does have some support from some of the findings and stuff like that. But since we're dealing with such a limited data set, remember, there's only really been one major scientific study of the shroud in 1978, where multiple samples were sort of studied in multiple different ways of testing and then taken back for microscopy. There's not a huge amount of study directly on the shroud. So it's very hard when we're looking at individual samples to sort of go, what is the strength of my findings based off of this one sample? And to be frank, going back to Fonte's paper that we were discussing earlier, this is a major criticism of Fonte's methodology in general throughout his papers. A couple years back, he published on hypothesis trying to state that the blood, the reason it's red is because it's been touched up with paint. And I remember Paulo de Lazzaro in a conference with Fonte getting a little snippy with him and just going, like, we can't make that assessment off of one sample using one sub-micron's worth of paint mixed with blood, because we know there's a lot of paint particles that are just not part of the shroud image or the blood images that are on the shroud. And that's going back to the dialectic in the 80s in regards to the blood images and stuff like that. So this is a challenge for anyone that's trying to do primary sort of study on it on the shroud, because the samples are just going to be so small. It's going to be very hard to sort of be able to present a robust enough data set to sort of survive this. So that's kind of the challenge in general with testing any of these sort of extant samples. In particular, when it comes to dating too, just because like whatever objections you're going to have to the C14 dating for being not representative of the cloth is generally going to also apply to a lot of these samples, unless you're going off of the main STIRP data, which most people don't have access to. There's those original samples. You don't have the material enough to really sort of avoid some of the criticism that might be coming back, if that makes sense.
Right. So what you're saying is that the 1970s, there hasn't been any direct studies on the shroud directly.
Well, there hasn't been direct sampling from the shroud. I should say that. There has been studies on shroud samples. The issue, though, is that when you're actually sampling from the shroud, you're able to contextualize it far more than what you can do just by receiving a sample. This was a big part of the 78 examination, and this is something that they talk about all the times in respect to the 2002 restoration, is that one of the things that they were able to do in 78 is that they were able to do all these sort of tests before they started doing the more invasive tests where they began removing material. So they were able to contextualize all their samples. They knew exactly where it was on the shroud, etc. Whereas in the 2002 restoration, it was much more of, we got to clean this thing. And this is one of the things that you do see from the STIRP, the surviving STIRP members. They were really disappointed that no one was brought in to consult the restoration team, because so much data was lost in their process of basically cleaning and preserving the cloth. So now you can sort of imagine it like, say you were in a crime scene, right? You have your bullet casings, you have your bodies, you have everything that's sort of, you have your broken twigs and everything sort of preserved. And that's how sort of STIRP wanted to operate, not interfering or interfering to the least amount. Whereas the 2002 restoration attempt, they were trying to clean it up. And subsequent to that, you get all your data sort of sort of mixed up. So they sampled a lot from their vacuuming in 2002, but what they didn't do a very good job of is that contextualizing it. So now we have lots of data sets, but we have no ways to contextualize them, part of the larger shroud. So there's this big hindrance in further research going forward. Like, how do we, account for what they did in 2002? And that's not to dogpile on the researchers in 2002.
Yeah.
It's just their main goal wasn't research. Their main goal was preservation. So that's a big challenge. What I wanted to also mention is just, if we can continue going back to our C14 dating, I want to talk about some of the developments in the dialectic since about the mid 2000s onward, because one of the big after sort of Rogers' sort of hypothesis became public, there was this new revived energy towards the Shroud study, which was really positive because it sort of brought in a next generation of Shroud scholars. But one of the big things that sort of happened in regards to the C14 dating was that there was, in response to Rogers, the Arizona lab attempted to discount Rogers' findings by showing a reserve sample that they had kept of the C14 sample, to sort of show that there's no cotton, that it's not, that Rogers' findings were not representative of the sample as a whole. Unwittingly, what they kind of did was kind of told on themselves that that their report in Nature in I believe it was 1989, when the formalized paper came out, that they never disclosed that they had kept a reserve sample. The assumption from folks on the outside is that they had sampled the entirety of the material. So basically, what we learned is that we went from 3 samples to 3 samples plus half of the sample being reserved. So that changes like a lot of the statistical data a little bit, just because half the material wasn't tested. So that was news to a lot of folks, and that sort of became a little bit of a suspicion amongst certain pro-Shroud scholars. It's like, well, if they didn't disclose this, what else didn't they disclose in their paper? So what ended up happening is that Tristan Casabianca, who's a French, I believe his background's in history, he actually petitioned freedom of information request, and he was able to access some of the raw data. And this is sort of the underlying sort of data that became part of his 2019 paper that he co-wrote, where basically he and a group of other researchers looked at the raw data and looked at the statistical findings and found that not only were they not representative of the findings in the 89 paper, they couldn't make their confidence statements. Basically, they couldn't reach this 95% confidence level. There was actually, depending on where the sample was, there was age grading basically. So on certain end of the shroud, it dated younger, and as you went across, it dated older. And that's really interesting, because if you think this sample is contaminated, that might tell you a little bit about the contamination a little bit. With all that sort of said, we need to sort of really sort of contextualize what this really means. What it sort of shows is that the sampling confidence level probably is not accurate from the Nature paper. That doesn't mean that the shroud is first century by any means. It doesn't mean that the medieval dating is incorrect. What it shows is that the confidence from the sampling just isn't there. So that's a big question. And it's kind of funny. I remember you sent me a post by a certain science popularizer going after the shroud a little bit. And it was really funny because it was a paper by Larry Schwalbe, who was one of the original STIRP members. And I read through the paper. I'm like, I don't know what he's trying to prove with this, because it seems like Schwalbe's sort of reinforcing what Tristan Casabianca was saying, that the 88 results, they don't have the confidence level that should be there from the data. So again, this is sort of where the dialectic's at. There's sort of this question about the heterogeneity of the sample. And that's really important to sort of contextualize. It's the the homogeneity of the sample with the rest of the shroud that's being questioned by some of these studies. What that doesn't get us to is a date. It doesn't show that's anywhere closer to the first century than what we've had since the 80s. And doesn't get us any closer to having a lockdown date from that. So we need to be a little bit cautious here. And this is like my main appeal to like the pro shroud side. Don't just sort of hold these studies up as like a disproof of the C14 data. That's not how we want to do shroud studies. We want to do it where we try to contextualize all data and come
including
up with
the C14.
including the C14. in a way that is least ad hoc and provides the most explanatory scope and power. So actually, this will get us to our fourth alternative. I guess this is probably the most out there sort of account for how the dating could be so wrong. This was proposed by Bob Rucker, who's a nuclear engineer, because he was looking at some of these statistical analyses and going, hang on. If I take like this imaging hypothesis by Mark Antonacci, and I propose that there's neutrons being released in addition to, I forget if it's free electrons that Antonacci uses for his imaging or not. If I take this sort of radiation idea and stuff like that, if I add protons to it, I can de-age a cloth that way. So what he did is that he used his background as a nuclear engineer, and he sort of mapped out the shroud and made a prediction. Like, I can get this aging curve depending on how close it is to the body. So the further we are away, the older the material is going to look. As we go closer to the body, eventually we're going to start getting dates into the future. And it's actually a really cool, ingenious sort of little way of sort of modeling that. Now, here's the thing. It's incredibly ad hoc. Like, as a dating method, like if we start allowing this, oh boy, like how are we ever going to date anything? In his defense, though, I think he's going to sort of defend it by sort of going, look, we have good reason for thinking this imaging mechanism works or is responsible for the image. So I can account for more data that way. I can account for the C14 data and the image, whereas most people can only get one or the other. And then he might go, well, I have this historical background of this purportedly being Jesus's burial cloth. And, resurrections are a pretty unique event. So it shouldn't be surprising that maybe there's some unique physical processes involved. I could see your Bayesian sort of going.
The priors are going down, bro.
Priors are going down. But what he's, at least one of the things I do appreciate about Rucker's attempt, and this is something that I've even heard Hugh Ferry, who's probably my favorite skeptic of the Shroud, sort of say, is like, look, he's done a really good job modeling it, and now we have a way to test it. He can actually build proposals off of that, which most folks, when they do these, miraculous or these radiation hypotheses, they don't. So this is a huge issue in regards to, like, how are we going to approach some of these more out there theories and stuff like that. And the other thing I really appreciate is that he tries to account for the C14 data without suggesting that everyone's either lying or it's wholly untrustworthy or something like that. He actually assumes the reliability of it and then tries to offer an explanation for the imaging and tries to do it in a coherent way. And, I just think it's, personally, this is where my heart's coming out a little bit too much. To me, it's too ad hoc right now. I don't think the data set supports it right now, but it's at least an attempt to sort of try and accumulate all the data. And that's something I don't see a lot of syndicologists doing. Most of the time, what you'll see is folks take their pet theories and they'll defend it hard, but they won't have conversations outside their little groups. And this goes for pro and con alike. So whenever I see a researcher that's trying to propose ways to account for the totality of data, that's where I get a little excited. And this is sort of another tip I would give to folks that are going through the literature, is like, if people are trying to attempt to give accounts for data, even data that seems to go against their hypothesis, they're actually trying to sort of account for all the data in a proper way. And this is how we should do science. Again, going back to the 1980s dialectic surrounding the blood, there was a big debate between Heller and Adler, who were part of the Stirp investigation, and Walter McCrone in regards to whether or not the blood samples were real blood or if it was red ochre pigment. And basically, you can sort of see the dialectic where McCrone goes, I have this one sample and it disproves the whole shroud, and these guys are crazy. And then Heller and Adler are like, hang on, our findings, our samples don't back that, but we can give an account for your sample too, via contamination. And that's I believe there's a lecture Adler gave in '86 where they actually invited both Joe Nickel and Walter McCrone, who were probably the two biggest Shroud critics at the time, to sort of give presentations. And Adler sort of goes after both of them. It's like, I have one hypothesis, namely that this is blood, and it can count for nearly a dozen sort of chemical features. That's a very simple theory. You can posit a chemical feature for two of them, but then you have to have this ad hoc reasoning to sort of account for all these other ones sort of being always found in these blood samples. So I can account for all your data really easy. You can't account for my data really easy. How are you going to sort of treat that? That's basically his challenge. And this is unfortunately something you do see sometimes in both pro and anti-Shroud stuff. When they encounter data that goes against their hypothesis, they will sometimes do all they can to ignore it. Very famously, around 2008, I believe Luigi Garlischelli actually produced one of the best artistic reproductions of the Shroud using his so-called frottage method. What's really interesting is that he was invited to be part of a panel in Italy to discuss it. And he was asked by Paolo de Lazzaro about what he thinks could account for the microscopic features of the Shroud, since Garlischelli failed to achieve those in his method. Garlischelli's response was, "I don't have to account for those data points." And de Lazzaro was sort of like puzzled, like, "What do you mean you don't have to account for those data points? Like, what are you trying to say?" And he's like, "Well," and Garlischelli in response went basically, "Well, my test didn't produce those results. Therefore, I can know that they don't exist there." And de Lazzaro was flummoxed. He's like, "What are you talking about? This is in all our primary literature. All these microscopic features are there from the STIRP investigation. There's no reason for you to invent your frottage method unless you look at that data set in the first place." He sort of recounts this in a paper called, oh my goodness, we'll post the paper. I can't remember the name off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's fine.
And he sort of just goes off on him. It's like, this isn't science. This isn't science where we come to where we have our conclusions predetermined, and then whatever doesn't fit our experiments, we don't just discount that evidence. If you want to see what a good scientist does when they can't account for the data with all their experimental data, and they want to maintain their theory, they do what Ray Rogers does, where he goes, "Well, my data can explain half this data set. That's what it's really there for. We need future generations to sort of fill in this gap." And that's how the dialectic should work. It should work where if you have contrary data to your theory, but you still want to defend your theory because you think it's right, because it has good explanatory power, you don't dismiss data from findings. You try to give examples and hypothesize new sort of aspects to your model. And we do this all the time in all different fields where we update our models accordingly. I mean, I know you do a lot of talks on philosophy of religion and stuff like that, but like, if you want to talk about models of God, there's a major difference in Christian history from where we were in the 2nd century with the Neoplatonic conceptions and where we are in the 20th century with folks like Craig, Plantinga, and then you have folks defending more classical models like Rob Koons, Josh Sijiwade. The models just develop as we see these new data points and these new issues within the dialectic. This isn't exclusive to Shroud studies. This isn't exclusive to scientific studies. This is just how almost every sort of academic venture goes. You propose a model, you test it to the best of your abilities. If there are outliers, you either discard your model or you propose auxiliary hypotheses to account for that. And then you weigh them with other hypotheses to see which has the best explanatory power, scope, and least degree of ad hocness. And that's just sort of normal in most fields, from what I can tell.
Yep.
Yeah.
Was there anything else you want to discuss? Like, for example, like the peer review sort of.
Yeah, I think this is something that's coming in a little bit because one of Fonte's papers subsequent to this that was on the blood studies was retracted due to lack of data. Again, I would recommend folks just watch David Falk's sort of stream if they want to get more of the details in that. Falk does a really good job of sort of breaking down each paper. And that's something that I just want to sort of also praise a little bit, especially for lay folks. If you can find folks like Falk or other folks in the literature that actually do have a background in dealing with this sort of stuff, start with their analyses. Try and sort of find their conclusions and stuff like that. And try and sample as much as you can from different experts to see where the conversation is. Because sometimes I know when I'm watching Falk, I'm a little confused by some of his objections, just because I'm thinking in the back of my head, like, hang on, there's this whole body of literature. And I don't know if he's interacting with that or not. And that's not to discount Falk. It's just limits to where it's communication limits, right? But this is sort of how, we do it when we're doing Phil of Religion too, right? We don't just read Craig. We don't just read Sijuwade, we read Api, we read Leon, we read whoever, right? And we try and sort of accumulate all that they've written and see where the dialectic actually is. And that's actually something that, we're really blessed as laymen to have all these scholars on very sort of public forums like YouTube, to sort of where they can discuss these and make these dialectic points very clear for us. It's very hard in the Shroud because, again, multiple different disciplines, multiple different folks with different backgrounds, perspectives, and not every paper is going to be equal to the other. One thing that you have to be very cautious of when reading the literature is identifying peer review versus conference papers, because conference papers, depending on the conference, don't go through the same level of peer review. So you can have a conference with really great speakers that really know what they're talking about, and they'll end up publishing, or they'll be summarizing their published work. And then you'll have some guys talking about, how the Shroud of Turin proves that Jesus was an enlightened Buddhist master and went through a rainbow body in the same conference. I've seen that happen before at video conferences. It's awesome. But that stuff's going to develop over time. So just a little bit of patience and just make your net as wide as possible. In regards to peer review, one thing that has to be sort of stated is, like, not always is it about, there's certain factors that come into peer review and how a paper can sort of make it through peer review in regards to the Shroud. Again, we've talked about this a little bit about the limited sample size. There's not a lot of samples out there. So it's very hard to do any sort of testing on sort of on the actual physical material of the cloth. So one really famous example of a paper that's sort of in limbo and always gets brought up, but depending on who you're talking about, they either use it to prove the Shroud or to prove that Shroud studies this bunch of pseudoscience, is I believe it was by Kolbeck. I might not be 100% sure on that name. It was looking at some dirt samples that were found at the foot of the Shroud. On one side of the Shroud, there is a foot that lays roughly flat. What was interesting is that when the STIRP investigators looked at it, they went, there's something on there. And they looked through them. They did their photomicroscopy and they said, that's dirt. And, immediately when you start thinking about it, it's like, well, if this really was a dead body, that's might be a good sort of way to test where this body was. So they ended up, the sample was being examined. And what they found is that their results, I forget the exact test that they used on it, but they found that it pretty well matched some form of limestone. And what was interesting is that this paper attempted to sort of categorize how well it fits in to do a geographical test, trying to compare it to different limestones found across the world. So what they found in their conclusion was that the best correspondence was with Jerusalem limestone found in the Jerusalem area. Now that's huge if that's accurate, right? Because it would seem to suggest somehow some limestone from Jerusalem wound up on the cloth. Now maybe there's different manners of contamination, right? It's been in contact with a lot of different people. Doesn't mean it's Jesus. Doesn't mean it's first century. But it would seem to suggest that at least someone or someone from that area was able to, leave an awful lot of dirt on there. And given that it's found primarily at the footprint and not elsewhere, that seems like a pretty good argument that this that you can make an inference that this is probably whose image it was responsible for the sample. Now, the issue for why it never got published through peer review is because their sample size was too small. They only had, I believe, like 3 samples to compare it to. And I believe one sample was from Jerusalem, one was from like northern Israel, and then I think another one was European. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so if I'm mixing up the details, I want to preface that right away. I just want to preempt that before someone goes, "Oh, you're just making stuff up." I'm doing this off the top of my head to the best of my ability, but you'll get the feel for this article. But because that sample set was so low, it wasn't able to sort of meet the standards for peer review, so it never got published. Now, the reason why it never met the standards, why they didn't do that, is because the particular author just didn't have access to enough material. There just wasn't enough material for them to actually test. And this is even something David Falk brings up a little bit in response to Fonte, that this is often a common retort amongst small sample sizes that Fonte uses. And it's a real challenge that we do have.
regardless if it's primary sources like that are coming from the shroud. There's a very finite amount of that was extant, that was examined, and a lot of it, depending on the evasiveness of the test, we don't have access to it anymore. But also sometimes just with the resources that are available to the researchers at the time, they're only able to do preliminary sort of examinations. And this is something that I think is very important attitude to start sort of adopting, is just really trying to sort of apply this principle of charity here. Because I don't think that the Kolbeck study is a bad study. It's just incomplete. And that's, I think, probably a better way to sort of look at some of these sort of more infamous studies that don't meet through peer review, but do get parroted a lot as proof of the shroud. Probably the most famous one would probably be the pollen studies done by the late Max Fry. There was a lot of contention surrounding his findings, but here's the thing: he died before he could peer review. He published peer review. He never finished it. Also, he was a criminologist in the 70s trying to do a pollen study before there were readily available large pollen databases available. So naturally, a lot of his study over the years that was made available has been contradicted by future researchers. But there's two attitudes you can sort of take at this. Either Fry's sort of like a maverick trying to just prove his theory, which I don't think is really fair to Fry. I think a better way to look at this is someone that is doing something new with his data set, and it just took time for the actual studies and the discipline to mature enough to sort of give us any robust understanding of the cloth as such. And when you start viewing it this way, you're able to avoid some of the ad hominems and some of the pitfalls I see a lot of pro and anti-shroud folks fall into on the popular level. You don't have to look at every study as almost red meat and stuff like that. We can contextualize these studies within the larger body of the literature so that when you do have positive results, you can sort of hold them almost at arm's length, right? This is positive data. We're going to let it mature. See how it lasts 5 years out. See how it stands 10 years out. And we'll adjust our credences accordingly. Doesn't mean that we're wholly skeptical. Doesn't mean that we're wholly, just blind and, gullible. We just sort of not withhold judgment, but we're going to sort of be cautious with how we come to our conclusions. And I think that's really, especially going back to the study that we started talking about with Fonte, we need to sort of treat this current study as well. It's not as though Fonte's it's not as though Fonte's, just some guy out there in his basement. He's had an impact in the shroud literature, but if you read the dialectics surrounding Fonte and stuff like that, different shroud experts, whether they be pro or anti, are going to sort of react to his findings differently than how the average person is, because they know Fonte's sort of tendencies in the same way that you or I might react to a paper put out by Graham Oppie. There's going to be our areas where we're going to really focus in on, right? And there's going to be areas where we sort of trust him a little bit more. But that's because we have an understanding of Oppie's literature a little bit more. So we know where the tension points are going to be. So that's sort of my encouragement to anyone that's pro or anti-shroud. It's just like, try and embody the principle of charity. Don't always assume the worst out of people. Just try to sort of dip your toes into this literature and sort of become absorbed with it a little bit.
Yeah, to sort of bit off of that, I know some skeptics want to dismiss some of the researchers because apparently they had some religious experiences or something.
Yeah, I don't know if that's who in particular that is, just because I don't know the biographies of the particular folks all that well, but that's sort of a trope you see throughout shroud studies, unfortunately. Again, talking about our good friend Walter McCrone, that was what he was really good at, is going to the press and really drumming up this idea that all the STERP researchers were religious fanatics. Didn't help that the spokesperson, Ken Stevenson, was asked pretty directly if he thought the shroud was authentic, and he responded quite, he let himself, he was very honest and said, like, yeah, I believe that's the cloth of my Lord and Savior. And suddenly all that red meat that Macron had been dangling was out there in the press and seemed perfect. Meanwhile, when you actually look at the actual biographies of most of the STERP researchers, there is no sort of religious connection here. John Jackson, the founder, was a devout Catholic, and he's still a devout Catholic. But one of the Joseph Aceta, who's was one of the original members, he didn't believe in the shroud after their investigations. He's an agnostic. To my knowledge, I think he's agnostic. I should be careful on that before I go out proclaiming folks' religious assumptions without knowing that personally. But he's sort of always been skeptical of it, and he's still proposing artistic mechanisms to this day to account for it. You had Barry Schwartz and Al Adler, who were both non-Messianic Jews, and they both became convinced that the shroud was authentic. And then you have other folks that were agnostic that sort of reverted back to Christian faith, not because they became so convinced of the evidence of the shroud, but because just by studying the shroud, they just kind of had to ask these questions about, who is God, who am I, and stuff like that. It's this funny idea that if you study, the image of Christ for so long, all of a sudden you're going to start asking these big metaphysical and existential questions about it. So I don't really care, to be quite honest, about people's sort of religious experiences and stuff like that. At the end of the day, it's what can the data sort of support. Like I said, Sue Benford, again, like Ray Rogers was not very kind to Sue Benford before he opened up his race sample for investigation. He called her part of the loony bin. And, if you read any papers published by Sue Benford, she has some out there ideas. And she's a layperson too. So, she doesn't, I don't really find her papers all that persuasive, but she just still had a big impact by her hypothesis that there was a reweave. And then, when you test that, and if you find positive data in it, it at least forces you to take it more seriously. So, I mean, there's all sorts of weird folks and all sorts of weird venues and stuff like that. And I think, if folks really want to hit on the sort of religious aspect of like why people study the shroud and stuff like that, that's fine, but it's not really going to help us in the dialectic. Because to be frank, nobody cares if you had a religious experience next to the shroud. Nobody cares if you're an atheist there. I mean, they have a huge shroud conference in England every year of Ahmadiyya Muslims, not because they think that it proves the resurrection, but because they think it disproves the resurrection. Now, I think they're all crazy because I just don't see how they can make their theory work with the data set. Now, that's my own personal sort of education of the data that they're sort of making, but I'm judging their arguments. Again, I talked about the guy that sort of suggested that this is proof of a rainbow body. For those that don't know what rainbow bodies are, read Dale Allison's latest book on the resurrection. You'll get a lot of information on that. And I just went, he's not interacting with the data set properly. Like, that's the main thing. You'll find all sorts of crazy folks in all sorts of fields. And the shroud, unfortunately, because of just the nature of what it is, it's going to attract a lot of folks. But until you actually read the material, you're never going to be able to assess the weight of the data sets. Again, like I said earlier, there's good reasons to doubt the shroud. There's good reasons to think the shroud is authentic. And until you actually sort of examine those directly and stuff like that, these sort of ad hominems, I don't really see what purpose they serve. Like if you look at Falk's critique of Fonte's work, he's talking specifically about methodology. He's actually digging into the data set. That's how we should critique papers. We shouldn't care about who
Yeah,
wrote
you
it.
don't want to poison the well. I mean, I know I'm not going to mention who, but there have been some skeptics that have tried to poison the well against the researchers. Which
are we gonna talk about our good friend on TikTok, or should we say that for another stream?
We'll just say his name is Dan. I'm sure you all know his last name. Say that.
He's got a good first name. That's all I'll say. He's got a good first name. But like I said, like consensus building is very hard in this field and stuff like that. So when you see outliers to your theory, trying to discount them as crazy without actually interacting with their research, it's worthless. Like there's no other way to sort of point this out. There's certain points where I take Fonte very seriously. His main contribution to the literature that I see quoted all the time by researchers of every stripe is on the image resolution, because he was one of the guys that really got a good quantification of the image resolution, which was very important in sort of challenging sort of gas diffusion models of image formation. So that's really big as far as like his impact on the literature. The other area where he was really important in was testing the effects of corona discharge to see if it might produce a shroud-like image. Now, I don't know where he stands, if he still holds to that or not, but he's still like the bulk of the body on it because he did the experimental data. He did the experimenting. And I know a lot of folks are not positive on his results there, but they still have to go to his research to actually assess it. Like on the pro Shroud side, I see people that really dismiss Luigi Garlaskelli's work, because Garlaskelli is kind of a professional skeptic. He does a lot of work on debunking miracles, so a lot of folks accuse him of bias. But some of the best analysis of Garlaskelli's work come from pro Shroud folks who take him very seriously at his word. They don't accuse him of manipulating results. They don't accuse him of bias. They simply go through his data and go like, yeah, this data set doesn't support his conclusion for X, Y, and Z. And that's how you build a dialectic, is folks that honestly look at the data set and critique it. You see similar things with regards to the art historian Andrea Nicoletti. Nicoletti's a guy that, if you don't have your arguments, he's not going to make it for you. He's going to throw everything at you in regards to going against the Shroud. But he's very poor when he steps outside his field. And there we need folks to sort of push back and sort of contextualize it. That's just how this dialectic is supposed to work. And over time, you don't always get consensus point, but you see where the dialectic survives. You see where data points survive and others fall away. Really famous point of this is regards to the blood, the nature of the blood is AB positive. That's something that gets talked about a lot. But over the years, a lot of the tests done by Heller and Adler in the 70s and 80s have been shown to be non-exhaustive as our approaches to dating old blood have improved. So now, does it test for AB positive? You can say yes, but that doesn't mean that it's AB blood. There are other sort of false positives that weren't accounted for in the original proposals, just because they didn't know about it at the time. Likewise, trying to identify the blood as human or primate blood also, as the data set improved, we've sort of found that there's new false positives, and these sort of tests just aren't inadequate to exhaustively rule out false positives. It doesn't mean that there isn't really blood there. It doesn't mean that the blood's not human. It just means that we have to contextualize this. And this isn't because of bad research. This is just how the dialectic sort of develops. And this is why, again, big thing I'm trying to ask for everyone, pro or con side, is when a new paper comes out, take a breath. Contextualize it as best you can, hold it at arm's length, and try and go through it and see where it's going to land out. And it's going to take time for folks to do responses to it. Unfortunately, synology, it's not a very sort of communicative field. Folks kind of find their own corners and stuff like that. And trying to get this big dialogue going sometimes takes a long time.
Yeah, I guess one last question is, could there be a way to either not prove, but I guess show strong evidence that the Shroud is authentic, or show that it's not? Or is that just not really possible unless we have direct access to the Shroud itself?
It's very hard to propose models that would sort of prove or disprove the Shroud. What we need to do is sort of contextualize it back into our actual theories of the Shroud. Because as far as I can see, there's a couple of different proposals to sort of account for what the Shroud is. One is that it's an medieval artifact, right? And that's sort of the typical skeptical response. The other is that it is a medieval artifact produced by a decaying body. So there's sort of a hybrid view that was actually, I believe, Harry Gove adopted, because he got so frustrated trying to sort of deal with some of the pro-Shroud folks because he didn't have good responses to the imaging data. And he's like, well, I can't get rid of the C14 date and I can't account for the image. Let me just say that it really is, a real body that produced the image and stuff like that. There's questions of how ad hoc that is too, but that's just another way that isn't discussed a lot in the literature. A third model is to sort of suggest that this really did cover the body of Jesus 2,000 years ago, and it's the byproduct of natural processes and decay. Fourth option is that this is the body of Jesus, but it's produced by non-natural processes.
Like radiation?
That's probably, well, radiation is generally the most talked about just because it's one that we can actually model. We can actually go from, it's a miracle, to actually, no, we can make testable predictions off of this. But there's also a fifth option that my buddy Dale Glover got me to sort of consider when we started talking about it, that the the shroud is medieval, but it is not an artistic or natural process. So you kind of have to sort of, there's not enough, I think, in the shroud just sort of laying out a theory comparison. We're going to lay out these theories and compare them and stuff like that, because you're going to have huge differences when you start calculating like your Bayes factor and just your priors. Like the last one I just mentioned, the priors are going to be astronomically low to start, just because there's no historical precedent for it. There's no account of any sort of miracle occurring, miraculous image appearing. Like, unlike if this was, say, like the Toma Guadalupe, at least you have a historical account there to sort of a tradition to sort of base it off of. So it's wholly ad hoc. But, you know, maybe you can, you know, if you're going to argue for it, you're going to have to argue, well, the C14 dating is really good and the imaging dating is really good. So I'm just going to go this route and stuff like that. So that's kind of the first step, is that we actually have to sort of look at what our actual hypotheses can be and compare them, what their predictions are going to be. So when it actually comes to different sort of ways to prove the shroud, quote unquote, it's very difficult without retesting. I mean, if you want to show that it's first century, it's very difficult to conceive a way to sort of evidence that it would be first century without some sort of radical new sort of discovery. Either new C14 dating, which probably is never going to happen because the Vatican's not interested in testing right now, or you're going to need some sort of strong archaeological or historical connection to our precise shroud to be discovered. Good examples of these would be like, say, the Prey manuscript codex, where it's an image that seems to represent the shroud, but it dates to about 100 years prior to the earliest C14 dating. Now that gives us some indication that that our C14 dating might be off, but it doesn't really get us that strong plausibility that it is ancient, right?
Right.
Another possibility would be to look at, say, the Sudarium, which is an alleged faith's cloth that would have been used to cover Jesus as they took him off the cross. That's currently located in Spain. Now, there's a lot of study on the Sudarium. Unfortunately, it's really hard for me as a layperson to access because most of it's either behind a paywall or it's in Spanish. So I'm a little, my research on that is a little bit less than perfect. But looking at it, what I have been able to see, it seems like you can make a coherent case that you can get it to cohere with the bloodstains on the shroud. But going from this really is a one-to-one and it can't be explained out otherwise, I don't think the data set's there yet. So if you had something like that, because then you could sort of push the date back to the 600s, then you're going, okay, there's definitely something going on with our dating methods and we need to reassess everything. That would be the only way I could see it really going ancient, unless you found some other artifact and could directly tie it to the shroud. Like, it's very hard for me to imagine different ways for the dating to go back that way. Even if we did have a successful alternative dating, you're going to have two data sets that you're going to have to cohere together, the C14 dating and this alternative dating. And how do you sort of account for that? And again, this goes back to what we discussed about. You need a simple, non-ad hoc explanation for why the C14 dating lines up so well with our historical accounts. That's really the challenge of the C14 dating. It's not it by itself. We have to sort of create this historical narrative that's going to be as simple or simple enough, at least, to sort of overturn the C14 dating. That's really hard to do. Now, there might be some ways to look at the image formation and go, well, we can rule out artistic processes, but that's not necessarily going to tell us the date. So then, maybe if some of these radiation type models, right? Some of them most of them are pretty ad hoc and kind of woo, for lack of a better term. They're, radiation does it somehow. That's the explanation you see a lot of times. But there have been a couple attempts, one by John Jackson in about 1990, where he tried to model a very new sort of model using soft UV radiation. The issue was that he had to invent a whole new set of physics to sort of get it to model. Yeah, so extremely ad hoc, but at least he was making predictions that could be tested. And this is what DeLazzaro's team ended up confirming in 2008 and 2012, that you could color a cloth using UV ultraviolet radiation. And that doesn't prove the model by any standpoint. All it shows is that you can't use UV radiation to discount the model. That's all you're getting from it. So it's still a long way off. But something like Rutgers' model, where you're actually making predictions off of like neutron radiation, if you could sort of test and get a second C14 dating, and if it matched his model for like how the cloth would age, that would be strong support for his imaging model. And in that case, that's pretty good evidence for a radiation hypothesis, and then you can give it pretty. It's once you get the data set, all of a sudden it starts getting its explanatory power pretty simply. But postulating it without the data set, holy cow, is it out there? So
Right.
that's kind of the challenge. If you want to prove, quote unquote, prove the shroud, it's going to be very hard to sort of imagine ways to do that. And some of the proposals are pretty out there. So maybe a better alternative would be, instead of trying to prove the shroud, trying to just do our best to characterize the image as best we can. Because what we can do really well is test image formation processes by modeling them and then testing them and then going, well, here's sort of the contingent set of states that would need to take place for this sort of imaging process to actually work on the shroud. And then you compare it to what our known data set from the STIRP investigation and some of our other known data sets to see if it confirms it or not. And unfortunately, sometimes folks, you just don't see enough of that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
One really infamous sort of attempt was by the BBC in a documentary where they attempted to test Ray Rogers' image formation process, where he posited that the cloth was soaked in saponaria during its manufacture. And then as the body decayed and it began producing gases that sort of colored this top layer of starch that was left over by the saponaria, and called Maillard effect. Sort of like caramelize, like when you caramelize onions or something like that, they brown a little bit. It's sort of along that lines. But they're testing, how they tested it is that they slaughtered 3 pigs, threw some linen on top of them in England in the middle of the year, and let them sort of sit out and decay. And what they found is that they just got big smears. Now, Ray Rogers wasn't alive to defend himself, but both Barry Schwartz and Paulo Delazzaro have sort of made statements like, this is wholly inappropriate to test this hypothesis. Even Delazzaro, who's, supporting a different hypothesis, he's admitting like, this isn't a good test of it because it doesn't match any of our, predicted sort of temperatures or just requirements that would be required for modeling if this really was Jesus. A pig's not going to be a great, a pig cadaver is not going to be the greatest model, especially if you're talking about some of the blood and biological chemistry of Jesus after going through a crucifixion. It's not going to be the best analog. Beyond that, a tomb's going to have much different airflow than an open air sort of paddock in the middle of England. That's, going to be incredibly humid compared to, Jerusalem. It's just not a good comparison at all. So unfortunately, that's what you kind of see sometimes in sort of testing of these hypotheses, is that you don't really get very thorough and exhaustive controls always all the time. This is why if you look at Paulo Delazzaro, we'll include this in the description, but Paulo Delazzaro has a couple good papers where he's going through attempts to do full-size replications of the image. And one of the persons that he actually praises is Carlos Skelly, the guy that he's sort of butting heads with all the time. But he praises him because he actually went through the process of trying to replicate the full shroud image and even some of the burn marks to the best of his ability. Because he went through such a rigorous process, he was able to construct a body of literature that is open to folks to critique. It's not simply this ad hoc, sort of guy in a basement saying he's getting discoveries and stuff like that. He's actually doing the process. And that's how this sort of dialectic is going to move forward, is folks actually not just simply making proposals anymore, but actually testing their proposals and making that body of literature available to the rest of the scientific community to critique. So in that respect, going back to our original paper, Fonte's kind of at least doing that bit. Now the question is, will it survive, the
criticism? Yeah. Because I know that blood study that was done, I think in 2018, got retracted because it got a major criticism. So
there's a lot. I will just sort of suggest folks read what if they want to. They can either read the retraction notes or they could go to David Falk's stream. He's going to go much more in depth than what we've done today. But again, just the main thing that we should always encourage folks is the principle of charity. Look at these sides equally. Try to sort of, put your biases aside and stuff like that. If this is the real burial cloth of Jesus, that doesn't prove the resurrection. That doesn't prove Christianity, right? In and of itself, you need an additional argument there.
Yeah.
So like regardless of our theistic or regardless of our worldview backgrounds, we should be open to this. There's nothing about the shroud that contradicts like Orthodox Christianity and stuff like that. Catholics have no problem with it. Orthodox Christians have no problem with it. Protestants should have no issue with it. I know there's some folks that get a little nervous about it being an image. I'm like, guys, if it's made by God, we don't take issue with the sun existing because God made it, right? Even though people can worship it, right? There's people that worship the sun in history, but we don't abhor the sun for it. This should be an open inquiry for Christians, just to sort of be open to it, because none of our theology rests on it. None of our cases for the resurrection rest on it. All this can really do is sort of help. If it is real, it can help us contextualize and learn more about the last moments and presumably the days after of our Lord, what ended up happening to Jesus. And in that case, it's one of the greatest historical artifacts of history. But if it's not, it is one of the greatest icons ever crafted by any human, because it has brought so much inspiration and edification to millions of Christians, both Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. It's brought people back to faith in God, not just if you actually look at the STIRP members, there were Christians that reverted back to their faith because of it. And then even you have Barry Schwartz, very famously, he gives credit to the Shroud for bringing him back to faith in God. He never converted to Christianity, but he's like, I didn't have a relationship with God until I started getting asked these questions about the Shroud. So, like, regardless of from a Christian perspective, wherever the Shroud lines up, it's hugely edifying to the body of Christ, because either it's one of the greatest artifacts that's going to tell us so much more about who Jesus really was and what happened, or it's going to be the greatest work of icons. It's going to be up there with Handel's Messiah or any of Bach's liturgical works. That's how we should view it, as an act of worship, I think. That should be really exciting for Christians to approach this, and it should encourage study regardless. Now, if you are not a Christian, you should also be interested in it, because again, one of the most important archaeological finds in history, if it's true. And if not, it's going to open up so many doors and unlock new science in regards to how these images are made. There's going to be a new artistic process. It's going to tell us something about medieval artistry that we just don't know about. Right. And that should excite us.
We're both agnostic. Totally agnostic.
I just to push a little bit, I would say I'd lean authentic, but I'm talking about 51 to 55%. That's sort of where like my base factor would be and stuff like that. And I do have to acknowledge, like, I do have like certain I don't have theological issues with it. And it's like, I know Cameron brought on Russ Briel, who talks about the Shroud, and I kind of have a similar attitude to him, where he goes, I can't really adjudicate on the science and stuff like that, but I kind of like some of the radiation hypothesis, because it seems like God likes using light for revelation, and it makes total sense to him that God might leave a receipt of the resurrection. So like, that's one of my bias points that I just can't get away from. It just, when we talk about our priors, it's just like, it makes sense that if the resurrection is a unique process, that God would be okay with it sort of leaving some evidence from it. And, until the data set matures and stuff like that, to where it really excludes some of those hypotheses and stuff like that, I guess it's always going to have a pull for me. But again, we're talking about an underdetermined data set. So that's why I sort of say I lean authentic. I'm not committed to it. But I think there just needs to be a lot more study.
Yeah, and then because I don't know anything about the literature, so I'm totally agnostic. I don't even assign a base factor, because I just don't know enough. So.
I mean, we could do a whole stream on the need for better epistemology in regards to Shroud studies, because you'll literally see folks that are like on more the skeptical or like naturalistic process side, chastising the folks positing more miraculous hypotheses, because they're like, you're not following the scientific method. And really, it seems like there's a little confusion by what they're getting at, because what they seem to be asserting as the scientific method is sort of a Humean concept of the laws of nature and stuff like that. And there doesn't seem like there's a good dialectic going on how one might account for new scientific data points that might force us to update our physics or our chemistry or whatever it is. And how do you actually reach a point where you realize you need a shift, that you do have an anomaly, right? Or are you forced to always just push that away and stuff like that? So like, how do you go about having a good dialectic with that? That's a conversation that I just don't think's present in Shroud literature that really should be. The other thing is like, stepping aside from the scientific data point, it's like, we have to make, if we're really going to sort of make this a holistic study, especially for folks like us that are more interested in like philosophy of religion and philosophy of analytic theology and stuff like that. Where's our say in this, right? When can we sort of take the scientific data points and go, okay, we can't scientifically say this is a miracle or whatnot, but can we put this in part and contextualize this in a larger sort of case for Christianity and stuff like that? Does it help us or does it do nothing for us? Can we make that sort of transition or not? That's something that's really interesting. I think you sort of see parallel sort of discussions in regards to sort of historical apologetics in regards to like the resurrection studies. I mean, you have folks like Mike Licona who will just say you can't infer God at all in history and stuff like that. So I got to show that the resurrection,
which is wrong, by the way.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I get what he's trying to do.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. But that's sort of the point where you have folks like Laura Robinson and Ian Mills that will just sort of say, like, you can't allow for miracles in history because then you're going to lose our methodological naturalism. Like, okay, so
that's begging the question. That's what that is.
Well,
you're begging the question. Yeah.
I'm just stepping aside and said, like, okay, maybe a historian can't say that, but what can a philosopher say that?
Yeah.
Like, can't I take all my data set and sort of try and cohere that? And you just don't see that discussion in Shroud literature, unfortunately.
That is true. All right. Anything else? I mean, I think we pretty much covered everything. Or is there anything else you wanted to?
Yeah, I would just sort of encourage anyone, regardless of what side they are, to try and do their best to steelman the opposition. There's very, very rarely do you actually get to see like large literature analyses in Shroud literature that are actually testing different theories and really trying to, go out of their way to defend their opponents. There's a couple examples, but not a lot. So what I would just sort of say is like, if you are on the skeptical side, here's the way I sort of see the dialectic and why there isn't more consensus regarding the Shroud. Is that you have two very disparate data sets. You have the C14 and the historical data that seems to strongly suggest a medieval dating. And then you have the imaging and the specific physical characteristics of the image that seem to strongly disconfirm artistic hypotheses. And it's not sort of a God of the gaps sort of argument. It's because of the data set that we do have that seem to preclude artistic hypotheses and really contradict them.
So that's the problem is you're dealing with conflicting data, basically.
Exactly. And unfortunately, even Barry Schwartz, I hate criticizing him because he was so influential to me getting into this study. And I really, actually, if you want a good jumping off point, listening to his lectures are actually a pretty good way to get at least the pro-Shroud side of the dialectic pretty quickly. But he would oftentimes sort of describe it this way. We have one scientific test that shows it's medieval, and we have a whole body of tests that show that it's not medieval. Unfortunately, that's not exactly how the data sets really work. A lot of the tests are kind of neutral. And, they might evidence one theory over the other, but they might not be super strong in that regard. And again, it's not simply the C14 dating in and of itself. It's the C14 plus the historical data that sort of forms the bulwark of the skeptical arguments against the Shroud. Now, there's sort of a third tier that they need to have a complete theory, which is a simple artistic hypothesis. And they don't even need to have the right one. They just need to have one. Unfortunately, that's the part that every honest skeptic, I should say, has sort of acknowledged that they can't do. Even Hugh Ferry, he's really good about this in his 3-part paper called The Medieval Shroud, where he's sort of going off in his hypotheses. He goes after every pro-Shroud argument that he can sort of think of, and he's going at him pretty ruthlessly. He's not a guy that sort of make your arguments for you. He's going after you. All of this sort of literature, which I really appreciate because you don't see that enough from folks, and especially folks that are as accessible as Hugh Ferry is. But then at the very end, he acknowledges there's still this $1 million question. How was it made? And I think we could sort of actually strengthen that a little bit and go say, all these how can an artistic hypothesis account for this data set that seems to be contradictory in its very nature? And this is something that Ferry talks about. He can get the individual data points with a lot of different artistic mechanisms, but getting them together is where the mystery still lies. And at what point do you start going from that to sort of suggesting maybe we're going about it the wrong way by taking an artistic hypothesis, right? And that's where, again, we need to contextualize it. not just with the scientific data, not just with the historical data, but also with some of our priors, right? What are our metaphysical convictions? What are our theological convictions, and how do those shape our inferences? And this is why I think really for from an apologetic standpoint, if you want to get into the Shroud, don't worry about trying to prove the resurrection with it. Start using Bayesian sort of analyses. That's what would be really helpful. It's just some sort of formalized epistemological approach to sort of weigh these different data sets. Because that's something that isn't really discussed enough in the literature, I love. And that's something that I think would actually be kind of impactful that we can do without accumulating new tests or new data sets.
Okay. Looks like that's pretty much it. Is anything else you want to say, or yeah?
No, just again, just thanks for having me on. And if there's one thing I do hope that comes out of this paper, there's a lot of excitement around the Shroud, and I hope that regardless of what you view, however you rate the current study, whether you think it's really great or whether you think it's really bad, I hope that this energy won't sort of detract from the study of the Shroud as a whole. Because regardless of what hypothesis you have, there's still a lot of work to be done in this. I think that's one of the real tragedies of the 88 test, is that it killed all the momentum for studying the Shroud. And that like we got one answer. We were able to get a C14 test, but it opened up so many more questions, and unfortunately killed a lot of options for it. So if you are very skeptical of the Shroud, I'm not advocating that you lose your skepticism, but let's try and find ways to work together with folks that are positive on the Shroud in ways that are sort of moving the dialectic forward. Same thing for the pro-Shroud folks. Don't just dismiss people as being naturalists or beholden to metaphysical commitments or just blind to the data and stuff like that. Actually try to find bridges to have communication. That way we can have the dialectic move forward. I know there's a lot of people that think that the Shroud's just really dumb for apologetics, and I can kind of understand if you're using the Shroud to prove the resurrection and stuff like that, because the data set's underdetermined, right? There's going to be tons of objections, and ton of obvious objections that you're going to have to weigh through. But I think what we need to do is sort of contextualize it more. It's just an interesting study, the way we do a lot of stuff in sort of adjacent fields to apologetics. So there's a lot of New Testament scholarship that isn't really polemical or apologetic, but it sort of helps our understanding of the field as a whole. That is also beneficial to folks that are into apologetics. And maybe if we approach it that way, we might be able to find a little bit more understanding, and we might actually be able to get some more progress moving, as opposed to just constantly throwing barbs at each other.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess that's pretty much it. And I guess, yeah. So, again, like I said, I don't take an opinion on this subject because this is not something I study. That's why I brought Don Daniel to sort of get the context of everything. So, anyways, I hope you guys like listening, and God bless you all.